This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Talking about Coretta Scott. And she was born in Marion, Alabama, and spent her childhood on a farm owned by her parents, Obie and Bernice Scott. And her father owned his own truck farming business and became increasingly successful, prompting harassment from the white neighbors who were jealous of seeing a black man succeeding. And resentful whites may have been responsible. The family always suspected it was so, for a fire that destroyed the Scott family's home. But the parents wanted better things for their offspring. And Obie and Bernice decided to encourage their three children to not only excel in school, but go to a private black institution that was set up with an integrated faculty called the Lincoln High School. And when Coretta Scott graduated from high school, she followed her sister Edith to Antioch College in Ohio. Antioch, as some of you know, has a reputation as being one of the more liberal colleges liberal arts colleges in the nation, and that reputation was certainly the case back when Coretta Scott entered it in the 1940s. And we're fortunate to have a recollection of why she went to college that she wrote and published as an undergraduate while at Antioch. And Awele, do you want to?
As far back as I can remember, I wanted to go to college. My parents were Negroes, respectable but poor, who lived in Hyburg, Alabama. I found early in life that being respectable did not necessarily bring respect, not in my hometown. In fact, the only Negro adults of the community in which I lived who seemed to be held in general esteem were my teachers, who were apparently respected for their positions, their training, and their leadership ability. They had great economic security. Although I know that they weren't paid high salaries, they didn't seem to have to worry constantly over money that way everyone else I knew did. They got more enjoyment out of life. They knew many different kinds of people. They could talk with pleasure about a lot of different subjects. They enjoyed books and music. They were even aware of the need for improving the political status of the Negro in the South, but for fear of losing their jobs, they remained silent. I concluded that the difference between them and other people I knew who seemed to me equally good people lay in their educations. Because of these differences, I decided that I had to go to college myself. For a Southerner, particularly a Southern Negro, it seems to me important to find out that there really are some white people working for racial equality and to be able to work with them. I've learned something from them. They've learned something from me. There are white people in the South working for racial equality. There are white people in the South working for racial equality, I know, but I wouldn't be as free to work with them as I am in the North. Also, a good education, it seemed to me, should be as free as possible, and that means free from Jim Crow as well as free in the classroom teaching. I'm now in my third year at Antioch and as a major in education and in music. I choose music as my field because I get more pleasure working with music than anything else, and I do have some ability and background in it. After I get my degree in Antioch, I would like to go to a music conservatory and specialize in voice. However, I'm also majoring in education. Concert work is uncertain, and whether or not I can secure recognition as a concert artist, I shall be able to support myself and get satisfaction from my job. I learned that there and a lot of so-called educated people, Negroes as well as whites, who never seem to have learned the fact of life about economics or sociology, or at least judge them by their action toward minority groups. Antioch College is a good place. It's private, progressive, co-educational, co-cooperative school. By cooperative, I mean that all of us who are students have had alternative periods of study with periods of regular work for regular pay on jobs throughout the country. These jobs are supposed to help us find ourselves on jobs and personally. I'm glad I came to college. I think I've got a lot from it. One of the biggest things I've learned, how much there is to learn. The more I study, the more excited I get about what I'm learning. The more I work, the more easier I find it is to do a good job. A college education has offered me more than a chance to better my condition, to acquire prestige, to earn my living. It has opened a lot of doors, leading in a lot of different directions.
I have a picture of Coretta Scott at that time that she wrote this letter. I'm sorry I didn't have time to set it to show through the screen. I hope you can see. Can you see the picture? Uh-oh. Let me go back. Why did it do that? Okay. Well, this is a smaller version of it. It'll stay on the screen more. She's carrying a banner. Anyone read what the banner says? Okay, does anyone know what the significance of that is? Okay, the Progressive Party ticket. What is the Progressive Party? Anyone know? Okay, the Democratic Party. What election are you talking about? 1948 election, the Progressive Party, Democrats. Who's running for president for Democrats? Truman. And Wallace is the candidate for the Progressive Party. And what's the main contention in the election? Civil rights, but
The Progressive Party is
more left, and over what issue is the most important? Cold War. Okay, what's the position of the Democrats about the Cold War? Truman? Okay, he's anti-communist. He wants to basically oppose the Soviet Union. He sees them as expansionists. Wallace is saying that the Cold War is a bad idea. Wallace actually used to be the vice president in the Roosevelt administration, but he decides to stage this third-party effort. So the significance here is that Coretta Scott, as a college student, is very much involved in this leftist progressive movement. It's during this time, I mentioned before that in high school she meets Bayard Rustin. She becomes a pacifist, develops views that are pretty far to the left of most Americans, and in terms of the black community, her views would have placed her close to two other people we've mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, also strong supporters of the Progressive Party. Now, Scott actually held her concert debut. She wanted to be a singer as a soloist. So in 1948 in Springfield, along with going to the Progressive Party convention, actually that picture there with the banner is at the youth part of the Progressive Party. So she's a youth activist. After that, she enrolls in Boston's New England Conservatory of Music, and with the idea of training her voice, developing her singing talent. And eventually she did earn her bachelor's in music and voice and violin. And while there, she met and began dating a young man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., a doctoral candidate also living in Boston. He was a doctoral candidate at Boston University School of Theology. Now, I obviously, in starting a lecture about Martin Luther King in terms of talking about Coretta, I think that she's a window into his life, and we can learn a lot about him through the relationship with Coretta. And one of the things that should be obvious immediately is that Martin Luther King did not bring Coretta Scott into politics. If anything, she was much more political, much more politically involved than Martin Luther King was at the time they met. There's a trope that often happens in films, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, and it's the guy goes off on his mission, and the wife is always the restraining force, trying to, and you see a hint of that in the film, although I think the portrayal of her is quite good in this HBO movie Boycott. But I think that in this case, that really does a disservice to her, of seeing her primarily through the role of both the wife and later the widow of Martin Luther King. As some of you know, I've written a play about Martin Luther King, and one of the things I wanted to do with the play was to try to tell more about the person I think he was by looking at his relationships, particularly with Coretta and with his parents. I think much of understanding Martin Luther King comes from these relationships, the very complex relationship on both sides with Coretta, and we'll trace that a little bit, but certainly with his father, a very strong, forceful individual, civil rights leader in his own right, someone who I think the son describes himself in the autobiography as being torn between the two options of his parents, the more maternal, nurturing side of his mother and the more forceful side of his father. And you can see that also in his politics, the way in which he's always seeking the middle course between militancy and moderation, trying to find some way of combining the best qualities of each of these courses. I was fascinated, actually, in terms of trying to understand how they got together. It's a rather unusual story when we think about 1952, the height of the McCarthy period, and here are two young black students who fall in love with each other, who are not only interested in each other for the normal reasons that people fall in love, but also are political, extremely political, in ways that I think are quite unusual for that period. So I'd like to just have Wele kind of read some of the dialogue that I wrote for this. And this is taken from the accounts of Martin Luther King, Coretta, about their budding relationship. And Martin says, "I understand that you're not only a wonderful singer, but also involved in politics." This is probably at their first meeting.
Yes. Before coming here to Boston to study at the New England Conservatory, I raised a bit of a ruckus at Antioch. One of those pacifists you've heard about. Actually, Martin, I feared you would be like the ministers I've known, fundamentalists, overly pious, wearing that look of sanctity y'all put on with that black suit.
Well, perhaps you've met the wrong kind of minister. I see you have a mind of your own, and it's wonderful that you can do something else besides sing. I've met quite a few girls in Boston, but none that I'm interested in. I want a wife. I want a wife who's as dedicated as I am, someone I can communicate it with.
You know, I'm not a Baptist. I haven't even been to church for a while. I used to go to the AME Zion back home in Alabama.
Just immersing yourself in water doesn't make you a Christian. I'm not a conventional Baptist minister. I believe in the social gospel. It's not enough to save souls. We need to change society so that the soul will have a chance. My father is a thoroughgoing capitalist, but I don't want to own a lot of things.
Actually, I feel the same way, Martin.
I think that making all the money you can and ignoring people's needs is wrong.
Me too.
And one of the things that struck me about Coretta's portrayal of Martin is how direct he was about wanting a wife. This was in part because he saw his career in the ministry, and he had to have a wife to do that. So Martin says, "Do you know something?
What's that?"
You have everything I've ever wanted in a wife. There are only 4 things, and you have them all." According to Coretta, this was on the first date, by the way.
I don't see how you can say that. You hardly even know me.
Yes, I can tell. There are 4 things I look for in a wife. They are character, intelligence, personality and beauty, and you have them all. I want to see you again. When can I?
I don't know. I don't hardly know you. I'll have to check my schedule. You can call me later.
And then Daddy King's account of how he found out about Coretta, I think, is interesting too. And this is Daddy King. When ML stopped charging telephone calls to us, that's when I decided there were only two possible reasons. Either he was working too hard or he was partying too hard. Something was distracting him from his studies. Then I heard from Reverend Hester in Boston that ML had been seen in the company of an extremely attractive young lady. And then Bunch says, right then he insisted that we get in a car and drive right up to Boston. Well, Coretta, I heard that you are a well-educated young lady. I want to know one thing. Do you take my son seriously?
No.
I'm glad to hear that you don't take him seriously, because unless you know him better than I do, I advise you not to.
I think I do know him better than you do, Reverend King.
You know, I don't understand this young man. He's gone out with some of the finest girls in Atlanta, beautiful girls, intelligent, from fine families, people we respect, whose feelings we wouldn't trample on. That one girl, you know the one, Bunch, she's very talented with a wonderful personality. We love that girl. She's got a lot to offer.
I have something to offer, Reverend King.
And
he just sat there so then she does an aside to the choir. He just sat there, grinning like an embarrassed schoolboy. I thought, why don't you say something? But he didn't want to hurt his father by going against him. But I soon learned that he made his own decisions.
So this is 1952 when they first meet. And Willie, why don't you just stay, since the next one is one of the letters. One of the things that we found, and I think you've seen some hint of it in the autobiography, are the letters that they wrote to each other in 1952, and it's a fascinating group of letters. One of the things that comes through is kind of humanizes Martin Luther King, because we don't have Coretta's side, but we definitely have his side, because she saved the letters. And what you see is a Martin Luther King that might surprise you a bit. For example, in the first letter, you see his angry side. What had happened was that it wasn't quite clear what had happened, since we don't have her letter, but it seems that he became upset over her insistence that she meet Martin's parents. She was going to come to Atlanta to visit him, and probably pushed on by her friends, who said, you know, if this is a serious relationship, you're going to Atlanta from Boston, you better, if he takes you seriously, he'll want you to meet the parents. Martin just wants her to come down, and doesn't, so this is the background of the letter.
Dear Miss Scott, I must regretfully confess that I am in no mood for writing you after your conversation with me last Saturday night. I see that you mean to insult me on every hand, and the insults seem to center around my parents. I have visited many, many girls and didn't stop at their homes, and girls have visited me before and didn't stop at my home. Your insistence on such a small thing made me so angry that I didn't bother to ask my parents about its appropriateness. I'm very angry that I am in such a mood. Maybe next time I'll feel better. P.S. You are under the influence of some frustrated women and men, or you just don't give a damn. By the way, ask these individuals who are telling you to be so precautious if they are aware of the fact that they could have been disappointed so many times because there is something wrong with them, rather than the persons who's disappointed them.
Less than a week later, Coretta had apparently repaired the rift with Martin. You notice that letter began with Dear Miss Scott. The next letter begins Dearest, so they've obviously changed. And one of the things that happens is that Coretta sends a copy of Edward Bellamy's utopian fantasy, looking backward. And you have part of this, an excerpt from this letter in the autobiography, but I wanted to read more from the letter because I think that it's a remarkable window into Martin Luther King's mind in 1952. This is 3 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. He talks about his views about Bellamy's socialist utopia, about Marx's materialism, and his views on revolutionary communism. And these comments are exceptionally candid, given that he's writing during a period of anti-communist hysteria. In fact, I think that it is likely that his subsequent career as a civil rights leader would have been irreparably damaged if this letter, with its anti-capitalist sentiments, had come to the attention of his segregationist opponents.
Dearest, fortunately I'm in a better mood today. Your letter was sweet and refreshing to my heart, which is well nigh grown cold toward you. Of course, I've become convinced in the last few days that my love for you is based on such a solid foundation that the stormy winds of anger cannot blow it asunder. Love is such a dynamic force, isn't it? It is the most inexplicable and yet the most beautiful force in life. Oh, how joyous it is to be in it. Darling, I miss you so much. In fact, much too much for my own good. I never realized that you were such an intimate part of my life. My life without you is like a year without a springtime which comes to give illumination and heat to the atmosphere, which has been saturated by the dark, cold breeze of winter. Can you imagine the frustration that Can you imagine the frustration that a king without a throne would face? Such would be my frustration if in my little kinghood could not reign at the throne of Coretta. Oh, excuse my darling. I didn't mean to go off in such a poetical and romantic flight, but how else can we express the deep emotions of life other than in poetry? Isn't love so inapplicable to be grasped by the cold, calculating hands of intellect? By the way, to turn to something more intellectual, I've just completed Bellamy's Looking Backward. It was both stimulating and fascinating. There can be doubt about it. Bellamy had the insight of a social prophet as well as the fact-finding mind of the social scientist. I welcome the book because much of its content is in line with my basic ideas. I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic, and yet I am not so opposed to capitalism that I have failed to see its relative merits. It started out with a noble and high motive, viz. To block the trade monopolies of nobles, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. It has brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. So I think Bellamy is right in seeing the gradual decline of capitalism. I think you notice that Bellamy emphasized the change will be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. This, it seems to me, is the most sane and ethical way for social change to take place. This, it will be remembered, is one of the points at which socialism differs from communism, the former emphasizing evolution and the latter revolution. Communists would insist that that means justify the ends. It is at this point that I am radically opposed to communism. Destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends. The means does not necessarily justify the end, for I would insist that the end is pre-existent and in the mean. Also, I'm quite bitterly opposed to the metaphysical structure of communism as well as Marxism. It is based on what is known as dialectical materialism. I, being an idealistic rather than a materialist, would therefore reject Marx as at this point. There is a point, however, that I have learned from reading Marx in books like Bellamy's, and that is that religion can so easily become a tool of the middle class to keep the proletariat oppressed. Too often has the church talked about a future good over yonder, totally forgetting the present evil over here. As a theologian and one deeply convinced that's the way of Christ is the only ultimate way to man's salvation, I will try to avoid making religion what Marx calls the opiate of the people. On the negative side of the picture, Bellamy falls victim to the same error that most writers of utopian societies fall victim to, these idealism not tempered with realism. In other words, such systems are impractical. Bellamy, with his over-optimism, fails to see that man is a sinner until he submits his life to the grace of God. Ultimately, our problem is a theological one. Man has revolted against God, and through his humanistic endeavors, he has sought to solve his problem by himself, only to find that he has ended up in disillusionment. Again, Bellamy fails to see that social systems don't die overnight. I don't think it gave capitalism long enough time to die. It is probably true that capitalism is its deathbed, but social systems have a way of developing a long and powerful deathbed, breathing capacity. Remember, it took feudalism more than 500 years to pass out from its deathbed? Capitalism will be in America in quite a few more years, my dear. Yet, with its basic thesis, I would concur. Our economic system is going through a radical change, and certainly this change is needed. I would certainly welcome the day to come when there will be a naturalization of industry. Let us continue to hope, work, and pray that in the future we will live to see a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and a brother that transcends race or color. This is the gospel that I'll preach to the world. At this point, I must thank you a million times for introducing me to such a stimulating work. You're sweet and thoughtful indeed. As to your visit to Atlanta, I would rather not go into a detailed discussion over it because I see that it can break up a beautiful relationship. I see that you're much more influenced by other people than you are by me. So maybe you would rather spend your vacation with them sincerely, since they have all the answers. Nevertheless, I still extend to you the invitation and hope that you will come. It hurt me very much to know that you believed that I would invite you to Atlanta and then mistreat you, especially as nice as I've been to you in the past. Oh well, I guess all of us have a little of the unappreciative attitude in us. If you're coming, let me know so that I can make the arrangements. If you don't desire to come, let me know soon, and I assure you that I won't mention it to you anymore. Of course, if you don't come, I'll know that you have no confidence in me, and I will proceed to think out of courtship in those lines. I hope we won't have to break up about this trip. Give my regards to Scotty and the other members of the gang. Be sweet, and remember that Daddy still loves you. Eternally yours, Martin.
When I first read those letters, it really struck me that the way in which the relationship was both political and personal and complex on both sides. I think it continued to be that way through the early 1950s when Martin and Coretta decided to get married in 1953. I think they had already made a commitment that their life was going to be dedicated to struggle. In part, that was made clear through their decision to come to the South. Both of them had the option of leaving the South and continuing their careers outside, and there would have been a lot of advantages to doing that. But both of them made a vow that they would return to the South and take part in the movement that was just beginning. This was particularly true after May of 1954. What happens in May of 54? The Brown decision. And with the Brown decision, it became very clear to each of them that the South would be the center of change. Now, I think another thing that comes through in the letters is that they give us an insight into Martin Luther King's religious views. Just the comment, his reaction to her telling him that she's not a Baptist. And what does he say? How does he respond to that?
Not all people that are immersed in water are Christians.
Okay, but to dismiss something. I mean, it is called the Baptist Church, right? So immediately you kind of see that he's coming to his Baptist convictions in a little bit different way. Did you have a comment? Yeah.
No.
Okay. Yeah. And what this has led me to, and is to look more deeply at Martin Luther King's religious attitudes. The recently published 6th volume of the King Papers focuses entirely on his religious attitudes. And during the time that we were preparing Volume 6, I received an email calling my attention to a religious website that called into question King's religious beliefs. Now, there's a number of anti-King websites on the web. You might have run into them in terms of looking him up. One of the, I think the third most popular website, sometimes the second most popular website, is actually set up by a right-wing group that's very anti-King. And you don't know it until you start looking very closely at the articles, and you see that most of them have an anti-King bias. This one was not necessarily that bad, because at least it was upfront about its purpose, and the purpose was to take away the notion that King should be seen as a religious leader, and particularly as a Christian leader. And I don't know if this website is still here. It was myfortress.org, by the way. And the argument on the website was quite straightforward. It said, in the writings of Martin Luther King, he clearly denied the deity of Christ, his virgin birth, his bodily return, his atoning sacrifice on the cross, and his bodily resurrection. And the evidence that was offered, and went on to say that a person can't deny these essential doctrines and still be a genuine believer in Christ. Well, what I found striking is that the evidence came from us, came from the King Papers Project here at Stanford. And basically, they went through and took the writings that we had already published, and probably now they've updated it with Volume 6, which even goes more deeply into King's religious beliefs. And you do see that there is evidence on their side that King's religious beliefs were quite unconventional. Now, before getting into this, I would add that when you look at the religious beliefs of many ministers, they are actually much more unconventional than their parishioners would assume. Part of what happens is that there is a disjunction between what one learns in a seminary, especially one of the leading seminaries where they practice historical criticism of the Bible, and look at the Bible more as a metaphorical document, a work of literature, and a document that came into being not as the revealed, as a divine revelation at one period of time, but something that came into existence over a period of time with many writers, many of whom are contradictory. Well, when we look at King, we find that by the time he encounters Coretta Scott, he is going through a period of religious transformation. He writes about this in a document that I think is one of the most important documents that we have about Martin Luther King. It's called An Autobiography of Religious Development. He writes it in 1950, so he's 21 years old. He's at Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. And he's in a class, and he's asked to describe the process that led him to choose a career in the ministry. A reasonable request for people to write when they're studying for the ministry. So he writes a handwritten paper, about 13, 14 pages, that describes his life in religious terms. So he calls it an autobiography of religious development. And he talks about how at the age of 13 he shocks his Sunday school class by denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus. After that, he says, his religious doubts began to spring forth unrelentingly. And this continues until he goes to Morehouse College. Now, he enters Morehouse at the age of 15. And there, from the testimony of people who knew him, he continued to have these doubts and did not want to pursue a career in the ministry. His decision to do that only comes after his junior year. And it's heavily influenced by a class he takes with Dr. George Kelsey. And he recalls, I came to see that behind the legends and myths of the Bible were many profound truths which one could not escape. Well, that phrase, I think, opens up a window into King in terms of his way of approaching biblical knowledge. One of the things I would say in general about King is that he writes in a very biblical way, that he uses a lot of metaphors, similes, as a way of conveying knowledge. And in the same way, the Bible can be read. Now, he found it initially difficult to transform these profound truths into the commitment required to become a minister, because he admits that for him, growing up in a household where the church is his second home, it's just down the street, it's where his father preaches, he said that he developed all of his social skills there, but in terms of his religious convictions, that came much slower. He admits in this document that he joined the church at the age of 5, not out of any dynamic conviction, but instead because he wanted to keep up with his older sister. This came at a revival meeting, and they asked people to come forward and give your life to Christ. And he saw his sister do it, and he felt enormous social pressure. You know, he's the son of the minister, so he goes up and does it. And afterwards, and this is writing perhaps 15 years later, he still feels guilty about that. That it wasn't true. He simply did it because of social pressure, not because of any inner conviction. But more importantly, he knows that he never experienced what he calls the crisis moment. He never experiences that moment of conversion, what we now would refer to as the born-again moment. And this crisis moment is something that many Baptists then and now see as a necessary part of true religious commitment. Now, what I find interesting there in looking at his religious development at Crozier is that all the way through, he's very candid again about expressing his doubts. He feels comfortable enough in this fairly, pretty liberal religious seminary to express these doubts to his professors, and they understand that, and they don't try to suppress that feeling. So in these papers, we get a lot of this rumination about the nature of his religious thought. I think we're thankful, as a historian, that I have this window into his mind, his developing mind. For example, it's only during his last year at Crozier that he writes in one of his papers that he begins to truly understand the nature of his relationship to God. Now that's a striking admission. When you're in your last year of seminary, you're about to become a minister, and you're still troubled, you're still uncertain about exactly what is your relationship to God. But he does in his readings, he comes to an understanding, and it's more of an intellectual understanding. It's not an emotional understanding. It's through his study of theology that he begins to develop an understanding of his religious faith. He goes off to Boston primarily because the theologian who writes the paper that leads to this revelation is at Boston. He goes there, and actually, unfortunately, that professor dies his first year, so he doesn't get to work with Professor Brightman. But he continues his studies at Boston, and significantly, his thesis is on systematic theology, that is, a study of the nature of God. His thesis, some of you know that some years ago on this campus we discovered that much of the thesis was plagiarized. This was a revelation that surprised us. It was something that we definitely did not expect when we set out to publish it in Volume 2 of the King Papers. And since then, I've tried to both explain and come to terms myself with this transgression of academic rules. Why did he do it? How did he do it? I think that we'll never know completely the answers to these questions, but one thing needs to be explained immediately, and that is the nature of his transgression. Plagiarism covers a lot of academic sins. I've had papers handed to me, and I found them to be plagiarized. Usually I discover that because the paper doesn't sound like a paper written by the student either I know or doesn't sound like any student would write it. And there's a suspicion that is raised, and you usually have a sense that this is something that was simply copied. In King's case, that is not at all what happened. The dissertation that he writes is quite original in terms of its basic argument. It's well developed. His teachers liked it and gave it high marks. And probably if he had never become famous, no one would have ever known. The only reason why we discovered it is that one of the things that I did in terms of preparing it for publication was to check King's sources to make sure that he had quoted them accurately. The students who started checking this started coming back and saying, yeah, he accurately quoted part of it, but there was more to the quote. And part of that was in quotation marks, part of it was not. So what was happening was that King was using other people to explicate his sources, that is, to explain the theologians that he was studying. Rather than using his own words, he would use the words of other people. And you would never know quite when their words ended and King's words began. It was a very sloppily done thesis. The newspapers really jumped on it, of course, and it was big news for a while. And this idea that Martin Luther King had plagiarized his thesis was used as a sense of not taking the religious writing seriously. And my argument from the beginning was, yeah, you have to take it seriously, because regardless of whose words he's using, he's expressing a consistent viewpoint. And that's the reason why his professors did not catch it, is that they looked at these papers, and it looked like a consistently King paper, and you find a consistent viewpoint about theology throughout his papers. And one of the other things that I tried to get across, but somehow didn't convince very many reporters to put this in their story, although I think it's the most important point, is that King does this throughout his life. That it only became a matter of controversy because it happened in an academic environment. But if you look at King's speeches, he does the same thing. The I Have a Dream speech is plagiarized. This is something that might surprise you, but if you look at practically every paragraph in that speech, it is taken from another source. It is taken from the Bible. It is taken from the Constitution. It's taken from the Gettysburg Address. It's taken from all of these various places, 19th century abolitionist oratory. The end of the speech comes from a sermon, another speech that was done by a minister friend of his, from every mountaintop let freedom ring, which again was taken from My Country 'Tis of Thee. So all of these things are adapted from these sources, and his genius was his ability to express himself through this borrowed language. So what we find in his theological writings is a person who develops a skill that comes in very handy once he becomes a minister. That is, he can take ideas from various sources, bring them together, and use them to powerfully express his own vision. And furthermore, the fact that these are from familiar traditional sources, I think adds to the power of his oratory and his sermons. Because you listen to it and you immediately, it has an emotional resonance with you. Why? Because he's tapping into your own political tradition, your own historical tradition, your own cultural tradition. And to the extent to which you are influenced by the Judeo-Christian traditions, you relate to his oratory, because he understands that when he says something like, let justice roll down like water, why would that metaphorical phrase have a particular impact on an American audience? Because most of them, even if they haven't read their Bible recently, they kind of know that this is biblical language, and it gives it a power. So I think that what I found is that by the time Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott meet in the early 1950s, what you see with King is that he begins to express himself with increasing power, this social gospel vision. And the social gospel for him is the essence of his Christianity. Now, I think that what I would add to this is that his religious development was incomplete. He saw it as incomplete, and he saw it as incomplete because even though intellectually he had come to a certain acceptance, a certain understanding of his religious conviction, he was one of the, probably in terms of ministers of his time, even today, he was probably more well-educated than 90-some% of ministers working in America. And during the early 1950s, if you talk about black ministers of that time, there were probably only a handful who had comparable educational backgrounds, and he knew half of those. People like Benjamin Mays and George Kelsey and others who had themselves gone through a process of theological training. So when the Montgomery bus boycott begins, I think what we see is a person who is just beginning to reach an understanding of what the social gospel meant for him. And what happens during the boycott is that an intellectual understanding becomes an emotional conviction. And in the autobiography, I think you can sense the moment that this happened? Just from your reading of when does this happen for him? Yes.
After the bombing of his home?
Yeah. I mean, it's about that time. It's actually a little bit before that, but he's getting an enormous amount of threats, and he begins to understand that decision he made to take on the leadership of the boycott, as indicated in the film, he didn't quite know what he was getting into. But certainly by January of 1956, when the white establishment begins to crack down on the movement, he's arrested under some pretense. He gets threatening calls all the time. He knows that the Klan is very active. This culminates in the bombing of his house. And one particular evening, and I think the date is actually pretty clear, it's the 27th of January, 1956, the day after his trip to city jail. The threats against him culminates in a spiritual crisis. And a particularly threatening call weakens his courage. A caller threatens to not only kill him, but to kill his wife and kids. And he's alone in the kitchen, and he sits there and he says, I was ready to give up. With my cup of coffee sitting untouched before me, I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing to be a coward. His courage was failing, and at that point he turns to God for help. And he recalls saying, the people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. And he wrote that his prayers were answered when he experienced the presence of the divine as he had never experienced him before. And he says, it seems as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever. Almost at once, my fears began to go, my uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything. Now, this is something that happened internally. Actually, he didn't even mention it publicly until many months later. And so he only gradually, and the best account of this only happens much later. The best account of this happens much later in the 1960s. And it happens at another crisis moment in his life when he goes to Chicago in 1966. And the Chicago campaign is a very difficult campaign. Some argue that it was a failure because he failed to achieve a major breakthrough in Chicago. And he gives a sermon at a black church. And it's on a hot, very hot day, and the church is packed, and people are looking to him for guidance, and he himself is feeling, well, why did I end up in Chicago? I mean, this was a decision that he had a chance to second guess. And it's during this sermon that he looks back at the Montgomery experience and sees that as a reason for hope. He says that just as in Montgomery, we began to doubt ourselves. We began to have this, and I began to doubt myself. And at that point, he goes into this story about his spiritual awakening. And that's probably as close as he ever gets to the crisis moment that he was looking for, that moment of decision. And for him, it's less a decision about belief as about the courage to carry on despite the opposition. Yes?
I come across something in reading the spiritual guidance that he consulted a mother, Mallard or Ballard, P-A-L-L.
Oh, yeah, Pollard.
Pollard.
Yeah.
Can you talk about her a little?
I think there was a Mother Pollard in the church, and she was the kind of his spiritual guidepost. You know, that he would look to her, particularly during the boycott. And she was the one actually who said something along the lines of our feet are tired, but our souls are rested. And he would often quote that as, here is an unlettered woman. You know, here is a minister with a PhD who is looking to this woman who has probably never got past grammar school. And nonetheless, she becomes the spiritual center because of her dedication to the boycott and carrying on the struggle during a 381-day struggle. You can imagine that there were lots of times when people began to wonder whether we should carry on. You know, if you have to, especially if you have to walk to work every day for 381 days, you understand that it better be worth doing. And you began to have some doubts about whether it's going to succeed and whether your sacrifice is worth the goal. Part of what King did, and I think his major contribution to the struggle, and Awele will talk about this more on Tuesday, part of what I think he did was to offer people a vision of the something more. That his greatest contribution was not as an organizer. I think Awele will point out that there were much better organizers on the scene. People who were able to put together the boycott, keep the carpool system running. King's singular failure, I think, during his lifetime was his inability to sustain over a long period of time a movement. But he offered a inspiration to that movement by telling them that it wasn't simply about getting a better seat on a bus, that it was about something more. And the something more you got from the speech that Jeffrey Wright quotes from, that it is justice, it is equality, it is all of these, it is what Jesus was talking about when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. And I can easily imagine someone on the 280th day saying that's what it's all about. That'll keep me going to another day. Any questions? Comments or? All right. See you. No, I guess I'll see you next week. Yeah.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.